Part 1, The Arrival of the Stranger. Heading: A Mysterious Encounter in the Stars. Commander Jackson Reed had seen his fair share of strange occurrences during his years aboard the interstellar cruiser Eclipse. But nothing could have prepared him for the day a lone escape pod drifted into the ship's docking bay, carrying a figure that would change his life forever. The pod's occupant was a woman, her skin a shimmering shade of emerald green, her eyes glowing faintly like twin moons. She introduced herself as Lyra, a refugee from a distant planet ravaged by war. Lyra's arrival was met with suspicion by the crew. The Eclipse was on a critical mission to deliver supplies to the outer colonies, and an unexpected guest could jeopardize their timeline. But Jackson, ever the compassionate leader, decided to hear her out. Lyra explained that her people, the Valens, had been enslaved by a ruthless warlord named Corax. She had escaped, but not before witnessing the destruction of her homeworld. Her plea was simple: she needed help to liberate her people. Jackson was torn. His mission was clear, but Lyra's story tugged at his conscience. He called a meeting with his senior officers, Lieutenant Mira Voss, the ship's tactical expert, Dr. Elias Trent, the chief medical officer, and engineer Cale Draven, who kept the Eclipse running smoothly. The debate was heated. Mira argued that they couldn't afford distractions, while Cale pointed out the moral obligation to help those in need. Dr. Trent remained neutral, focusing on Lyra's physical condition, which was deteriorating due to the stress of her journey. As the discussion wore on, Jackson made a decision. They would alter their course slightly to investigate Lyra's claims. If her story held true, they would assist her in any way they could. The crew reluctantly agreed, and the Eclipse set a new course toward the Valen system. Heading: A Bond Forms in the Void. As the days passed, Lyra began to integrate herself into the life of the Eclipse. She spent hours in the ship's observation deck, staring out at the stars, her expression a mix of longing and sorrow. Jackson found himself drawn to her, not just out of duty, but out of a growing sense of connection. They shared stories of their respective worlds, finding common ground in their love for their people and their desire to make a difference. One evening, as they stood together on the observation deck, Lyra turned to Jackson with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "For believing in me. For giving me hope." Jackson placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "We'll find a way to help your people," he said. "You're not alone anymore." But their newfound camaraderie was soon tested. As they approached the Valen system, the Eclipse was ambushed by a fleet of Corax's warships. The crew scrambled to their stations, the ship's alarms blaring as they prepared for battle. Jackson barked orders, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Mira, target their engines. Cale, divert all power to the shields. Dr. Trent, prepare for casualties." The battle was fierce, the Eclipse outnumbered and outgunned. But Jackson's quick thinking and the crew's unwavering determination turned the tide. They managed to disable one of Corax's ships, forcing the rest to retreat. As the dust settled, Jackson turned to Lyra, who had been watching the battle from the bridge. "We're not done yet," he said. "This is just the beginning." Heading: The Weight of Leadership. The encounter with Corax's fleet left the crew shaken but resolute. Jackson knew that their mission had just become infinitely more complicated. They were no longer just delivering supplies, they were now embroiled in a conflict that could have far-reaching consequences. He called another meeting, this time to discuss their next steps. Mira was the first to speak. "We need to gather intel on Corax's forces. If we're going to take him down, we need to know what we're up against." Cale nodded in agreement. "And we need to make sure the Eclipse is ready for another fight. I'll start working on upgrades to the weapons and shields." Dr. Trent, ever the voice of reason, added, "We also need to consider the human cost. If we're going to help Lyra's people, we need to be prepared for the possibility of casualties. We can't save everyone." Jackson listened to his officers, his mind racing. He knew they were right, but the weight of leadership was heavy on his shoulders. He turned to Lyra, who had been silently observing the meeting. "What do you think?" he asked. Lyra hesitated before speaking. "Corax is a tyrant, but he's not invincible. If we can rally the remaining Valen resistance, we might stand a chance. But it won't be easy. Many of my people have lost hope." Part 2, The Seeds of Rebellion. Heading, A World in Chains. The Eclipse landed in a secluded valley, hidden from the prying eyes of Corax's forces. The crew disembarked, their weapons at the ready, as they took in their surroundings. The once thriving planet was now a shadow of its former self. The forests were scarred by the remnants of battle, the cities reduced to rubble. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and decay, a grim reminder of the devastation wrought by Corax's tyranny. Lyra led the crew through the ruins, her heart heavy with sorrow. "This was once a place of beauty," she said, her voice trembling. "Now it's a prison." As they moved deeper into the valley, they encountered a group of Valen survivors. The sight of Lyra brought a glimmer of hope to their eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. "You shouldn't be here," one of them whispered. "If Corax finds out, he'll kill us all." Jackson stepped forward, his presence commanding. "We're here to help," he said. "We're here to fight for your freedom. But we can't do it alone. We need your help." The survivors exchanged uneasy glances, their fear palpable. But then, one of them, a young man with a determined look in his eyes, stepped forward. "I'll fight," he said. "I've lost everything to Corax. I have nothing left to lose." One by one, the others began to step forward, their fear giving way to resolve. They were tired of living in fear, tired of being oppressed. They were ready to fight for their freedom, no matter the cost. Heading, The Spark of Rebellion. With the survivors' support, Jackson and his crew began to lay the groundwork for a rebellion. They set up a base camp in the valley, using the Eclipse's resources to provide food, shelter, and medical care to the Valens. Lyra worked tirelessly to rally the people, her words inspiring hope in even the most downtrodden. But as the days passed, it became clear that their efforts were not going unnoticed. Corax's forces began to patrol the area more frequently, their presence a constant threat. Jackson knew that they needed to act quickly before they were discovered. He called a meeting with his senior officers and the leaders of the Valen resistance. "We need to strike fast and strike hard," he said. "We need to hit Corax where it hurts, his supply lines. If we can cut off his resources, we can weaken his hold on this planet." Mira nodded in agreement. "We'll need to gather intel on his supply routes and identify the best targets. But we'll also need to be careful. Corax is no fool, he'll be expecting us to make a move." Kale, ever the pragmatist, added, "We'll also need to make sure we have an escape plan. If things go south, we need to be able to get out of there fast." The meeting lasted late into the night, the group working tirelessly to finalize their plans. By the time they adjourned, they had a solid strategy in place. They would strike at dawn, targeting a key supply depot on the outskirts of the capital city. Heading, The First Strike. The next morning, the crew of the Eclipse and the Valen resistance set out on their mission. They moved silently through the forest, their weapons at the ready, as they approached the supply depot. The depot was heavily guarded, but Jackson's team was prepared. As they neared the target, Jackson gave the signal. The team sprang into action, their movements swift and precise. They took out the guards with ease, their training and coordination paying off. Within minutes, they had secured the depot and began to plant explosives. But just as they were about to make their escape, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Corax's forces had arrived, and they were not alone. A massive armored vehicle rolled into view, its turret trained on the rebels. Jackson's heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. Fall back, he shouted. Fall back now. The team retreated, their movements frantic as they tried to put as much distance between themselves and the depot as possible. But it was too late. The armored vehicle opened fire, its bullets tearing through the trees and sending debris flying in all directions. Jackson and his team hit the ground, their bodies pressed against the earth as the bullets whizzed overhead. They were pinned down, with no way to escape. Jackson's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan, but there was no time. Just as all hope seemed lost, a loud explosion rocked the ground. The armored vehicle was engulfed in flames, its turret spinning wildly as it was consumed by the fire. Jackson looked up to see Lyra standing on a nearby ridge, a rocket launcher in her hands. "Let's go," she shouted. "We don't have much time." The team scrambled to their feet, their movements fueled by adrenaline as they made their escape. They ran through the forest, their hearts pounding in their chests, as the sound of the explosion echoed behind them. Part 3, The Gathering Storm. Heading: The Resistance Grows. The success of the first strike against Corax's forces galvanized the Valen resistance. Word of the rebellion spread like wildfire, and soon, more and more Valens began to join the cause. The base camp in the valley swelled with new recruits, their faces filled with hope and determination. Jackson and his crew worked tirelessly to train the new recruits, teaching them the skills they would need to survive in the harsh realities of war. Lyra took on a leadership role, her natural charisma and determination inspiring those around her. Together, they began to build a formidable force, one that could stand up to Corax's tyranny. But as the resistance grew, so too did the threat from Corax. His forces began to increase their patrols, their presence a constant reminder of the danger they faced. Jackson knew that they needed to strike again, and soon, before Corax could regroup and crush the rebellion before it had a chance to truly take hold. Heading: A Dangerous Mission. Jackson called a meeting with his senior officers and the leaders of the Valen resistance. "We need to hit Corax again," he said. "But this time, we need to hit him where it hurts the most, his command center. If we can take out his leadership, we can cripple his forces and give the resistance a chance to grow." Mira nodded in agreement. "But it won't be easy. The command center is heavily fortified, and Corax will be expecting us to make a move. We'll need to be smart about this." Kale, ever the pragmatist, added, "We'll also need to make sure we have a solid escape plan. If things go south, we need to be able to get out of there fast." The meeting lasted late into the night, the group working tirelessly to finalize their plans. By the time they adjourned, they had a solid strategy in place. They would strike at dawn, targeting the command center in the heart of the capital city. Heading: The Battle for Freedom. The next morning, the crew of the Eclipse and the Valen resistance set out on their mission. They moved silently through the city, their weapons at the ready, as they approached the command center. The building was heavily guarded, but Jackson's team was prepared. As they neared the target, Jackson gave the signal. The team sprang into action, their movements swift and precise. They took out the guards with ease, their training and coordination paying off. Within minutes, they had breached the command center and began to plant explosives. But just as they were about to make their escape, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Corax's forces had arrived, and they were not alone. A massive armored vehicle rolled into view, its turret trained on the rebels. Jackson's heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Fall back," he shouted. "Fall back now." The team retreated, their movements frantic as they tried to put as much distance between themselves and the command center as possible. But it was too late. The armored vehicle opened fire, its bullets tearing through the buildings and sending debris flying in all directions. Jackson and his team hit the ground, their bodies pressed against the earth as the bullets whizzed overhead. They were pinned down, with no way to escape. Jackson's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan, but there was no time. Just as all hope seemed lost, a loud explosion rocked the ground. The armored vehicle was engulfed in flames, its turret spinning wildly as it was consumed by the fire. Jackson looked up to see Lyra standing on a nearby rooftop, a rocket launcher in her hands. "Let's go," she shouted. "We don't have much time." The team scrambled to their feet, their movements fueled by adrenaline as they made their escape. They ran through the city, their hearts pounding in their chests, as the sound of the explosion echoed behind them. Part 4, The Turning Point. Heading: The tide begins to turn. The success of the mission against Corax's command center marked a turning point in the rebellion. The Valen resistance grew stronger with each passing day, their numbers swelling as more and more people joined the cause. Corax's forces, once seemingly invincible, began to show signs of weakness. The tide was beginning to turn, but the fight was far from over. Jackson and his crew continued to lead the resistance, their determination unwavering. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. They were fighting for freedom, for justice, and for the future of the Valen people. Heading: A new threat emerges. But as the resistance grew, so too did the threat from Corax. Desperate to maintain his grip on power, he began to employ increasingly brutal tactics. His forces began to target civilian populations, their attacks designed to instill fear and crush any hope of rebellion. Jackson knew that they needed to act quickly to protect the innocent. He called a meeting with his senior officers and the leaders of the Valen resistance. "We need to strike back," he said. "We need to show Corax that we won't be intimidated. But we also need to protect the people. We can't let him win by fear." Mira nodded in agreement. "We'll need to set up safe zones for the civilians, places where they can be protected from Corax's forces. But we'll also need to be ready to defend those zones if they come under attack." Kale, ever the pragmatist, added, "We'll also need to make sure we have enough supplies to support the growing resistance. If we're going to keep fighting, we need to make sure we have the resources to do it." The meeting lasted late into the night, the group working tirelessly to finalize their plans. By the time they adjourned, they had a solid strategy in place. They would set up safe zones throughout the city, places where civilians could seek refuge from Corax's forces. They would also continue to strike at Corax's supply lines, weakening his hold on the planet and giving the resistance a chance to grow. Heading: The battle for the safe zones. The next morning, the crew of the Eclipse and the Valen resistance set out on their mission. They moved quickly through the city, their movements swift and precise as they set up the safe zones. The civilians, desperate for protection, flocked to the zones, their faces filled with hope and gratitude. But as the day wore on, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Corax's forces had arrived, their presence a grim reminder of the danger they faced. Jackson's heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Defend the zones," he shouted. "Protect the people." The team sprang into action, their movements fueled by adrenaline as they prepared to defend the safe zones. The battle was fierce, the sound of gunfire and explosions filling the air as the two sides clashed. Jackson and his team fought with everything they had, their determination unwavering as they protected the innocent. But just as the battle seemed to be turning in their favor, a massive explosion rocked the ground. One of the safe zones had been hit, the building reduced to rubble in an instant. Jackson's heart sank as he realized the cost of their failure. "Fall back," he shouted. "Fall back now." The team retreated, their movements frantic as they tried to put as much distance between themselves and the battle as possible. But it was too late. Corax's forces were relentless, their attacks designed to crush any hope of rebellion. Heading: A new resolve. The team regrouped at the base camp, their bodies bruised and battered but their spirits unbroken. They had succeeded in setting up the safe zones, but the cost had been high. Several members of the Valen resistance had been lost, their sacrifices a grim reminder of the stakes they were fighting for. Jackson stood before the group, his expression somber. "We lost good people today," he said. "But their sacrifices were not in vain. We protected the innocent, and we showed Korax that we won't be intimidated. But this is just the beginning. We have a long road ahead of us, and it won't be easy. But if we stand together, if we fight together, we can win this war." The group nodded, their determination unwavering. They knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but they also knew that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. They were fighting for their freedom, for their future, and for the hope of a better tomorrow. As the sun set over the valley, Jackson turned to Lyra, who stood beside him. "We did it," he said. "We took the first step." Lyra smiled, her eyes filled with determination. "We did," she said. "But this is just the beginning. We have a long way to go." Jackson nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then let's keep going," he said. "Together." And with that, the seeds of rebellion were sown, their roots growing deeper with each passing day. The fight for freedom had begun, and there was no turning back.